WatchPitch podcasters and videocast YouTube watchers. We're so glad to have you back in the thick of this series and focus on exits, mergers and acquisitions, how you do it, what you should be thinking about as you're looking at a potential exit, and the mechanics of how that actually happens. I am so thrilled to have David Madison here from Home Trust Bank, and somebody who's strategically involved with helping to finance these deals and also to actually put these deals together, understanding that there are really good fits when it comes to a potential merger and acquisition, and where there isn't really a fit. I cannot wait to dig into this with you. I think there's a lot of value from your perspective that's going to help our listeners, our startups, our entrepreneurs, even our current business owners who are beginning to think, you know what, this series on exit strategies is talking to me. And I'd love to learn more. So glad to have you on the show.
Trey, thank you so much for having me this morning.
Sure, absolutely. I appreciate the rally.
Looking forward to the conversation.
Well, good. So just to get us started, why don't you give us a little perspective on where you are right now in your career in this space? Because I know you've had the experience of being on the other side of the table, of being a business owner and having an exit yourself, but also what your role is and what are the metrics that you go through to think about and to support somebody who wants to buy a business and somebody who wants to sell a business.
That is a loaded, full question, and we can talk for the next few hours on that.
Good. Well, we're going to do that.
All right. My background is I've spent probably 30 years in the finance world. At the same time, I've been a serial business owner, sometimes together, sometimes apart. So I go back and forth. I've done a lot of real estate, finance, and for the last few years, it's been on the small business side. A lot of Main Street things, but the interesting thing is we were, discussing a little bit earlier some large corporations and the principles that took place there in terms of culture and what works and what doesn't work.
Culture is a big part of any fit, I would imagine.
It's huge. And when I'm looking at a business, I'm kind of thinking of it as a three-legged stool, and it's the simplest way to look at it. On one hand, you have the business that the buyer is looking at purchasing. So you want to make sure that the business itself is a good, solid business with a good history and sustainable cash flow and income and prospects going forward without the owner who created that or who led that, that the business itself has legs. Second thing is you look at the buyer. You want to make sure they have a good history, good background, skills, talents, history, and aptitude, ideas that are applicable, that work. And then here's the most important one is how do those two things go together? Does that buyer fit the business? You could have the world's greatest dentist who is running a practice, with staff, with dental assistants, with hygienists. You could have a 10, 15, 20-person staff and be running a multi-million-dollar business. But could that dentist run a small chain of restaurants? Probably not. Talented individual with lots of education and skills, totally different mindset from somebody who's running a restaurant or running a hotel. So there has to be a good fit. And so what I'm certainly looking at is how do the parties fit? Do they make sense? And then after that, then we get into things like tax returns and P&Ls and numbers, but never lead with the numbers, always lead with the story. So.
Well, and I want to dig into this story piece, and I think what I'd love to do is break this down a little bit. First, for the business owner who has decided, I think I'm kind of finished with the business, and maybe it is that dentist, or maybe it is that restaurant conglomerate owner. Maybe it's that small tech company who's got 2 or 3 products or a SaaS product that they realize, we've been at this for 10 years, 15 years. We have a machine that's working very well with regards to and I put machine in quotes, just in terms of a well-oiled production machine. And the idea is, as an owner, I'm thinking about an exit. And we're going to approach this from the buyer side as well and what they're looking for. But I'm particularly keen And I imagine there are people that come to you where they've been into a business for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and they're looking to sell. Are those conversations happening with you?
All the time. They absolutely do.
So how do they sound?
Well, here's where I think maybe some good ideas or information could come from.
Okay.
The worst thing that can possibly happen for the seller of a business is they are the business. Because that business going forward isn't terribly viable without that seller being the heart and soul of it. What I look at is, and especially you want to have at least a 2, 3, 4 year exit plan. You better know now that you're going to sell the business 3, 4 years from now. Because if you have to sell it right now, there's no way in the world you can prepare for that.
Now, is that just because of the process of selling, or is that more like a sort of you have homework to do?
You have homework to do. It's positioning. So, for example, let's say the owner of the business, or let's say to operate the business successfully, there's a certain amount of or certain type of education or licenses. And the way I look at it is a business has the most value when you have the greatest number of potential buyers for that business. Then you have competition. Well, let's get really simple and use a heating and air conditioning business.
Great.
Just a very simple mainstream business. If the only person in the company that has the necessary license is the owner, then the only person that could then buy that business going forward is another person with a license. On the other hand, if the owner of the company has 2 or 3 employees who he can motivate to sit for the test and get their license, you've opened up the world in terms of potential buyers. They don't necessarily have to be licensed. Yeah, they've got to have an aptitude for the subject matter, but they can be true business owner operators while the technical piece is handled by the staff. So I would make sure that I have 1, 2, 3 people working in my company who can handle the technical regulatory license component of that business, or special education or degrees or whatever it is. I want to make sure they've got that in place so that I can open up my business to the greatest potential number of buyers.
I would imagine in some of those cases, there might even be some of those people internally, when it's understood that that's a path that the owner's going on, who might actually be the ones buying the business from him. I mean, they know the business in and out. I would think that if they were in a position to do so,
a key manager is absolutely, without question, the best buyer of a business. Not only from the likelihood of being successful, but as a lender, the biggest risk that we see in a business sale is what we'd call transition risk, meaning the old owner that's the heart and soul of the business goes away and a new person comes in. They come in with a whole new set of cultural ideas, pressures, because the old owner never had financing on the business. The new owner does, so he's got a new payment he has to make. When you have a key manager buying the business, we look at it and the transition risk is pretty much gone. You're not going to lose key staff. You're not going to lose key customers. You're not going to lose your vendors. Everything just continues. So absolutely the best buyer of a business is a manager or a small group of key managers in the company.
Fascinating.
It's a great point.
Yeah. So in that transition cost, is that what was the term? Transition?
Just transition risk.
Yeah, transition risk. Is that a metric that shows up in any kind of decision with regards to financing a potential M&A?
Well, you can't quantify it, but it takes away so many of the what ifs.
Right.
What if the key person or the key employees or the sales manager or the operations manager, what if they leave? Can the buyer step in and handle those roles or competently find somebody else who can handle those roles? That risk goes away. So we as a lender can be much more comfortable that the business itself will continue rolling along and doing what it does.
You know, I'm thinking about an individual that has a business like that in a sort of parallel either industry or at least the scale is like that. And I would imagine that one of the biggest and greatest paths to a potential exit is, as an owner of a business, identifying potential buyers of that business and starting that conversation kind of on their own with either customers that they may have. And we had a guest a couple of episodes ago whose biggest customer ended up being the ones who purchased them, because these guys had some very specific software that was going to support their business. They'd already been doing business together, so the culture was a fit already, and it just was a logical extension of their relationship just turning into a merger or acquisition in a very friendly way. And I don't know how often that's the case, but I'm imagining that it actually helps if a business owner is out in front of that trajectory and beginning to even do work on their own to maybe look for that potential buyer.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
And to piggyback on your idea, the other idea is to talk with your major vendors. Because they're going to know all the players.
Right.
Very often when business gets sold, it's sold to a competitor and rolled into that prior company, rolled into the acquirer. So I would say now you've got to be careful, because you don't want word getting out
that you're for sale.
That you're for sale. But if you have a really good working relationship or partnership with some of your key vendors, they might know people who want to get into the business. Even in a very, very carefully orchestrated way, the vendor might potentially look to be an acquirer. Now, of course, they have to be careful not to become competitors of their other customers, but there are ways to do that and make it work.
Fascinating. So I would imagine you haven't always been in banking. Tell me a little bit about your businesses historically, and because you did mention you've kind of done this a few times in terms of either buying and or selling businesses. What's your fascination with that space?
God, I've been all over. I've been involved in real estate development, shopping centers, and things like that. That was fun. My most recent project was a venture that I did with my wife, where we purchased in Raleigh, North Carolina, an old line school supply store. Store had been around forever.
So this is for like homeschoolers or just supplementary
teachers? Elementary school. We sold materials to teachers and schools and that sort of thing. It was interesting because the company had been owned by a group of 7 previous former employees. They bought the company from the family that generated the business in the first place.
I see.
We bought from them, owned the business for a few years, and then had the fun of purchasing a piece of real estate and building a brand new building, moved that business into the building, and then expanded from school supplies and having one of the larger toy stores in the Raleigh market. That was total fun. The school supplies was, kind of old hat, and it was what it was. And my wife and I love going to toy shows, and
I'll bet.
So we kind of grew that, and it was fascinating, to go through the cycles and the challenges to see how that worked. We've done that. We had an interior decorating and design business. So it's fun to go back and forth, but what it does is it really keeps you grounded. Too easy to be a lender and just look at numbers and wear suits all day and fit into a certain mold. But when you've been on the other side and had to make a payroll and deal with customers and returns and questions and all the other things, you really get the complete circle.
Gosh, they must love you at Home Trust Bank because of that experience and your ability to really connect with those owners and understand on a cellular level just exactly what they're going through and the kind of pressure that's on them as a business owner.
Well, the biggest thing that I found was a new respect for prospective business buyers, because it's so easy as a lender to look at the transaction kind of, I don't want to say coldly, but coldly. Do you do the deal or not do the deal? And obviously I'm compensated to do transactions. But what I realize is what's going on behind the scenes, which is if a given person is buying that business, probably they had a job, they had a salary, they had stability. They are now going into a life-changing situation. They're not buying a car. They're not buying a house. They're giving up their jobs, in many cases relocating, moving their families. They've got spouses. They've got kids. They've got responsibilities. And they're fundamentally changing their lives. And I take that responsibility of participating in that extremely, extremely deeply. Because I'm not just dealing with, do we do a loan or not? I'm potentially messing with somebody's life. I'm enabling to do something that's wonderful, it's going to be transformative, or I'm enabling to do something that could be disastrous. And that's serious stuff.
Yes. Well, I guess I'm particularly keen on this notion that there is a group of potential buyers who, or at least are thinking about buying a business and saying, you know what, I've got enough to purchase a business. I've never met a group of people who are buyers. I've certainly been in the angel investor circles and people who are investors who want to have a little bit of involvement with a business, but not necessarily want to actually roll up their sleeves and get into the business. They're really thinking about it as a pure financial play for some future equity and something that they see that's going to grow. But it's very curious to me that there is this kind of dugout of potential buyers who are actually looking for deals. And would they knock on your door to have that conversation, or not knowing this culture very well? And I'm saying this as a entrepreneur and business owner myself. Where do I go to knock on the door to get access to that dugout of buyers?
Interesting question. Most of the buyers who I work with came to me from business brokers who are representing the seller of a company. And they're advertising or doing whatever they're doing. They attract prospective purchasers. And then those business brokers contact me and ask me to start working with the prospective buyer to determine if they're financially and otherwise suitable or capable of engaging in the transaction.
So you're qualifying those buyers?
I am.
I see.
But I'm taking it a step further than just financially qualifying them, circling back to what I talked about earlier.
Right.
I'm evaluating them from the perspective of, is this business the right thing for them?
Right.
What gets really interesting or challenging is when I'm talking with multiple buyers referred to me by a broker who are all interested in the same business.
Oh, dear.
And now I'm being asked who's best.
Right.
Let's assume we could have 2, 3, 4 different buyers, all of whom are willing to pay the full asking price, who are willing to pay exactly the same terms.
Fascinating.
The question is, who's the right one?
Okay. So then let's break this down into, say, green lights, yellow lights, and red lights or flags. And the idea is, what are the characteristics that just make this a green light situation where it's like, yeah, this is a perfect match? And where do you start putting up a yellow flag and going, yeah, maybe not a fit? And then where do you just hit that red button and the red light goes on and like, this is a non-starter. This is never going to work. I'm very curious.
Interesting question. Probably the first thing that I want to do, ideally, is understand the current owner of the business. Who is he? What is he? What is his role? What
or
does
her?
he do?
Yes, sure.
Yes, her or her. Absolutely.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
What do they do in the company? What is their role? Once I understand that, then I can start trying to determine whom among the candidates, or if there's just one candidate, is he or she going to be able to sit in the current owner's chair and pilot the ship competently. But I have to really understand first what the requirements are for that position.
And I know that certainly one red flag that we've talked about is that if that owner is doing everything and hasn't really gotten their business on a systems sort of approach where now individuals are empowered to actually run that business without necessarily, that heavy hand of the owner always being involved in the operations, then that must be some kind of indication that, okay, this business is not necessarily dependent on that owner. That must be a good sign.
That's crucial.
Yeah.
You almost never want to see a business where the owner's name is the name of the company.
Oh, dear.
Yeah, we see that with builders, with contractors.
Right.
And then the next red flag there is every single piece of major business that's sold is sold by that owner. Talk about red flags.
Right.
It becomes very, very difficult to find that person's replacement because the value in the company is that person as opposed to the team, the staff, the support, the culture, and everything else that goes with it.
So other red flags or green flags that make a lot of sense to you when you do that initial conversation and inquiry with a business owner who's looking to sell?
Well, obviously the financial component. You want to make sure that the buyer can execute. You want to make sure the buyer is diverse enough in their background and experiences that they can be flexible and adaptable to handle the inevitable bumps that any business buyer is going to experience. There are going to be surprises, and some will be delightful surprises, and about 80% won't. And that can be everywhere, anything from a key employee leaves to customers go, vendors don't offer the same.
Big anchor client, yeah.
Any of those things. And what you want to make sure of is when you're dealing with a buyer, he or she is adaptable and flexible and can really roll with the punches. That's probably the biggest yellow or red flag are individuals who are just too doctrinaire or too rigid in their thinking.
Do you find that buyers of businesses tend to have some affinity for the business they're buying versus someone who, like an example would be, let's say a very famous person who's in the entertainment industry, music, film, television, has decided to diversify. They see the writings on the wall. Maybe they're not as successful as they have been in the past as an entertainer. And whether they're on the stage or off the stage, whatever kind of business that they're in, but let's say it's the entertainment industry, but they have acquired a lot of wealth and they'd like to grow that wealth in a way that allows them to still be involved with the business and actively want to participate in that business as a business owner, but maybe it isn't necessarily an entertainment business or isn't related to that business. Is that a risk to want to enter into the purchase of a business that's sort of out of the expertise range of that buyer? And is that a yellow flag?
It, I think, is a risk. Think about how many stories we hear of professional athletes, for example, taking a chunk of their money and buying a car dealership or a restaurant or something that they know absolutely nothing about. Usually those stories don't turn out well.
Right.
Sometimes they do, but it requires that person to be actively engaged, and they really probably need to have some of the basic aptitudes and skills and thinking that a good business owner is going to have. They're not going to make it just on their name. That just won't happen. But if they're going to throw themselves into the business in a meaningful way, it doesn't mean 24/7, but they have to commit themselves to doing that. Think about it this way: from the perspective of the owner of a company, he or she has built that business, and there's a legacy there, and if they do it right, they want to make sure that the purchaser of their business treats that legacy carefully and respectfully. And so they really need to be doing really good due diligence on the buyer to make sure that that company, that business, their child, is going to survive and thrive. It's more than just dollars.
So what deals, looking back, that you're aware of have gone really well? And what are some deals that have not gone very well? Can you share any particulars, and you don't have to necessarily name
Sure.
people or companies, but I'd be fascinated to hear, a scenario that has worked out really well.
Okay.
And then maybe some that you just know were disasters and be able to help us understand why.
All right. I'm going to scale one. I'm going to do a success story first.
Okay, great.
And I'm going to scale it about as small as you can get.
Okay.
Had an individual who was the manager of 3 yogurt shops in Virginia.
Okay.
It was a franchise company, and he basically ran those 3. He wanted to own his own business in a space kind of like that. He found a business in the North Carolina Outer Banks, out on the coast. And it was sort of a hot dog stand, yogurt, ice cream shop. He entered into a contract to buy the business. It was a challenging situation from the perspective of the current owner not being so easy, but we were able to circumvent that. He moved his wife and 3 kids from Central Virginia out to the Outer Banks.
Goodness gracious.
Completely changed his life. I mean, forget the business. Just talk about a change of life.
The view out the window certainly changed.
And he is thriving. The family has never been happier. He's loving his life. The nature of that particular business, he has about 4 or 5 months a year that are down. So he uses
He's
that.
He's fine by that.
Loves it. He gets to travel, or the family gets to travel and do things they couldn't do otherwise. They all pitch in running the company, running the business. He's making 2 to 3 times what he's ever earned before.
Wow.
And because it was the right culture. He had a passion for it. It just, the story was perfect. And when I look back at my career of doing small business lending, the one that'll give me chills, because I know that I did something to fundamentally change a whole family's life, is that one. So that's one.
Love it.
Let's go to the downside.
Okay.
Had a transaction where the buyer of the company, the company was a manufacturing business located in the Midwest. The buyer, smart guy, MBA, had plenty of money to execute. He tended to be more an engineering type than a leader, personal type. Bought the business, which was a very successful business, earning probably over $1 million a year in cash flow. And within 6 months, the business closed. None of his employees could work with him.
6 months?
6 months.
Wow. Now, did he roll up his sleeves and jump into the business actively?
He did.
He did. Oh, I'm hearing that. Like, he didn't, and he did.
And what's more amazing about it is that the prior owner of the company stayed there with him with the idea of mentoring him and coaching him and helping with the transition. And it didn't matter what he said or did. This buyer would not listen. He was going to do everything his way, and he completely, we'll say, changed the culture. He destroyed it.
Gosh.
And he lost his customers, he lost his vendors, he lost his employees, and a very viable, vibrant $3 or $4 million value business literally went to worthless in half a year. Never seen anything quite that bad.
Wow. So that speaks volumes to that culture piece.
It was huge.
Yeah.
This person completely destroyed the culture. he basically unvalidated, I don't know if that's the right word, but he took whatever worked and went exactly in the opposite direction, thinking that he knew it all and could just totally revamp the company and change it and make it even better. And had he just sat back and listened and learned from the old owner and the key staff and the employees and the customers, he'd be making more money and having more fun and running his dream business. But he just was on a mission to self-destruct.
I cannot emphasize how important this point is, and I'm in the thick of reading Bob Iger's story about his time at Disney, Ride of a Lifetime, and when he talks about their relationship with Pixar, which was kicking Disney's butt in the theaters because they were just creating great content. The culture of Pixar was such that it just inspired creativity within its own culture. And that is not what was happening in Disney. So the conversation initially with Michael Eisner before Bob Iger took over was really along the lines of making sure, and this was a conversation with Steve Jobs, who, of course, was running Pixar as well, alongside the original founders of Pixar. And, you know, when that conversation came up initially, it was so clear that the culture of Disney was so different from Pixar that any conversation about any kind of merger there started with, we have to be sure that these two cultures don't mix. Because if Pixar becomes Disneyfied in their culture, Pixar will end as we know it. And I really want to recommend this book and this journey where these leaders recognized that it was super important not only to turn up the volume on the Pixar culture and protect that, but if anything, figure out a way to bridge that culture into the Disney animation culture to revitalize that culture as well, which is exactly what happened under the leadership of Bob Iger. And this had nothing to do with the numbers. I mean, sure, the numbers played themselves out in the theaters, but at the end of the day, you know, when an owner is courting a potential buyer, those early conversations about sort of strategy and approaches to life, approaches to relating to people, whether they're your own employees or your vendors or your customers, those kind of conversations, I imagine, have to be so aligned with regards to values and the ways we do business. To me, if there's a disconnect there, it seems like a non-starter is what I'm hearing.
Absolutely. Let me take that example and bring it down to a smaller, I mean, that's a multi-billion dollar type
publicly
of thing.
traded companies.
Let's
yes.
get extremely practical here.
Okay.
I had a professor in an entrepreneur class years ago, and he made an interesting statement, which was a person who buys a business or owns a business will, whatever that person does to change or improve or grow the company, he or she will do 80% of that in the first 3 years of their ownership. And then they could own the company for 10, 15, 20 years. Pretty much whatever they put into the changes in the first 3 years, they'll just ride that out. So let's look at this in a perspective of somebody new stepping into a company.
Sure.
She buys the company. You have a group of employees who have probably been living in a very steady state, calm, relaxed, day after day type of existence. Not a lot of pressure. The previous owner of the company probably had no or very minimal debt. They were making a perfectly adequate income and everything was just fine. In comes this new buyer, and she's got a new bank loan. It's new. There's all the nerves and everything else. And then there's all the energy to come into the company. All of a sudden, this 3-year burst of changes happens. And most of that happens right at the very beginning. Well, what's going to happen to all those existing employees who've been used to living in a non-pressured, relaxed,
unchanging. Yeah.
Immediately, there is a culture crisis, culture clash. And it doesn't matter that it's a technological company, or it doesn't matter the nature of the business. The fact of the matter is that we have a whole new culture that needs to be dealt with. So purchasers of that company had better be cognizant to tread lightly, delicately, learn the personalities, and then engage those individuals who are there and enroll them in his or her vision for what they want to go forward, and create opportunities for those people to grow and expand in the same way.
Right. So those first 3 years seem to be absolutely critical. And I would imagine then that for the employees, knowing that all this change is happening, do you see a lot of turnover happen in organizations and businesses where there is a merger or acquisition?
Usually we see one of two things. If it's the right buyer and the right group of employees, typically there's very, very little turnover. There's actually a reinvigoration and an excitement that happens, and all of a sudden those individuals who were unchallenged and unmotivated all of a sudden see fantastic new opportunities, and they grow and the company takes off. That's the wonderful version. The other version is those individuals were so entrenched and so stultified by the previous situation that no matter what the buyer does, when he or she steps in and starts running the company in their manner, we see 50 to 80% turnover of the key people. And that becomes quite a shock for the buyer to handle, which is why we're looking at that personality going in and asking, can he or she handle those types of bumps if and when they happen?
And I imagine, there's not a lot of people that do that over and over again. So that's a little bit of an untested factor. That's a little bit of an X factor as to whether or not that new buyer can actually make that adjustment well.
Well, what we found is that first-time buyers have a much tougher time of it than somebody who has purchased a previous company or two.
That makes sense.
So that kind of leads me to when I'm talking with prospective business buyers to make sure that they aren't stepping into a situation that's larger than something that they can handle with their resources, both financial and personal, because they're going to make mistakes. Everybody makes rookie mistakes. That's what they call them, rookie mistakes.
Right.
So better for your first purchase of a business, be a little humble and buy something that you can absolutely handle, make your mistakes, and then when you want to really go for it, it's that second or that third business that is where you should do it. But by that time, you should have been able to learn how to adjust to those things. And
when we're talking about that size of that business, is it about their revenue size or their employee size?
I look at it from the perspective of the size or the amount of the consequences of a mistake. The loss of a key customer.
I see.
The loss of a key employee. How challenging would it be, and what are the costs to deal with those types of situations? And does the buyer have the resources, whatever they might be, to handle that type of situation? Sometimes when you're dealing with larger companies, no one employee or no one customer can drastically move the needle, and it's easier to deal with. So every situation's kind of unique, and you have to look at it from that perspective.
Well, what I love, and I think that one of the biggest takeaways from this conversation is really about how at the center of any kind of purchase or sale is people. And you can spend a lot of time on those numbers, but at the end of the day, those numbers represent people and transactions. And if you don't have that people factor figured out, then that's a yellow flag.
Oh, it's huge. I think of it almost like a song. There's music and there's words. And you can have absolutely the most amazing words, but if the music doesn't work with it, that song will never in a million years sell. But think about all the songs that have fabulous melodies with nonsense words.
That's right.
And they're tremendously successful. So think of the people piece, those intangibles. That's the music.
Yeah.
The numbers are the words. And yes, you want the numbers to work.
Sure.
But if the music's not there, you're looking at a potentially very bad situation.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us here on this WatchPitch podcast. The time flew by. Is there anything you'd like to leave any of our listeners with in conclusion, and then any way that they could reach out to you if needed?
Sure.
Okay.
I absolutely would welcome folks to call me.
Great.
Can
okay.
I give my business phone number?
We'll put that in the liner notes.
Okay.
So that people can reach out to you. Great.
But I would just invite people to reach me, and
Good.
I'll be happy to have the conversation with them. And if I can help them, great, in terms of really doing something for them. But if not, just to listen to their story and give them, hopefully some good objective advice, I'd be happy to do so.
Well, this has been super valuable, and I really want to thank you for your time, David.
All right.
Really
Thank you, Trey. It's been great.
All right. Cool. My pleasure.